Good morning. My name is Benjamin. I'm sorry about the mess. I intended to clean it up last night, but it went so late, and well, I thought there was not going to be anybody here this morning, so I thought I'd be able to come in, and clean it all up. You should have been here, though. It was something else. But evidently, somebody had dropped the ball when I arrived, because when we got here, nobody had taken the thought to make sure that somebody was going to wash the feet of the guests. I think there was a man named Jesus, and I think, let's see here. Oh yes, 12, a group of 12 that were with him. And so they had come into this place, and they were going to have a meal together. And well, there was no way that I was going to wash their feet. I am the head steward, a servant. And the truth is, Jerusalem Health and Safety would have had nothing with me doing that, because I handle food. And I mean, I'm not going to touch dirty, stinky feet and clean them off. So anyway, I was there standing, waiting, watching them. And it was almost embarrassing as to what happened, because, well, there was this man, like I said, Jesus, who I'd heard about his teaching, about his healing, about all these different things that he'd done. But this evening, it was a little different. In fact, it was kind of strange, because even though this man had kind of an air of authority about him, there was, he was kind. In fact, I wanted to serve him as best I could. There was just this desire inside of me. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar, but as a servant, many times it seems like people look right through you. You know what I mean? They don't even see you unless, of course, you do something wrong. And then, of course, the last thing we want to be done is seen. We want to hide in the corners, in the shadows. But this Jesus made me feel like I was seen. Anyway, he was at the head of the table, the place of honor. There were a couple of other guys who were there. I think, if I remember correctly, one was named John, and he was sitting right next to this Jesus fellow. And then next to another on the other side of him was a guy named Judas. They seemed to have the other positions of honor in this table. And it was about that time that when I first really noticed the fact that nobody's feet had been washed. I was beginning the serving of food and making sure that the others who were helping me were putting it in the right places and doing the right thing, bringing out this stuff as it was needed. And I noticed that the feet of everyone were dirty. And this is when we saw something that was, well, it was extraordinary. It took my breath away. Just listen.
It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him.
Was awestruck by the events that he saw taking place in front of his eyes. And I'm not talking about the bread or the cup. Not even talking about the teaching that was taking place around that table. I'm talking once again about the actions of Jesus that we see taking place. The washing of the feet. I mean, you can even see the basin and the towel right over here. We've heard the story so many times, though, that I don't think it catches us as it should. It no longer takes our breath away, because in some respects you can say it's what we expect to see Jesus do, right? And yet I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to reflect with me on the word that you've just heard proclaimed. I mean, it's clear that this is more than just another meal, isn't it? It's clear that we find ourselves at the end, near the end. And even in the text, that word end is used. It said that Jesus loved them to the end. Maybe you're wondering, well, what does that mean? I think in some respects it speaks to the cross. But I also think it speaks to all that the cross proclaims. It speaks to the utter and complete nature of God's love for us. That Jesus doesn't love us this far. He doesn't love us this far. He loves us all the way to the end. You get what I'm saying? As we continue reflecting on this scene, we cannot afford to forget this idea. That this is more than just a charade that Jesus is. It's more than just a moral lesson that Jesus is giving us. It's more than an example. It is first and foremost a declaration of God's love for you and for me. It's a declaration of this love that goes to the end, that is complete, utter. Now, John sets the scene, doesn't he, so well. He's a wonderful writer. There are elements of light and darkness within the text. There is the knowledge of the betrayer in the mind and the consciousness of Jesus that is lifted up in this story. Jesus is not going to be caught off guard, evidently from John's perspective, of this man named Judas and his betrayal. He is completely aware, but that's not all he's aware of. We're told in no uncertain terms that Jesus is fully conscious as well of who he is. I mean, there's no doubt from the text that Jesus knows his identity, right? Or what lies before him. He knew that he is God incarnate, the Son of the Almighty. He knew that all the power was his. He knew where he'd come from and where he was going back to. Which, I don't know about you, but leads me to have whiplash as I go to verse 4. I mean, you did catch it, right? You did catch what John shares in those verses. Jesus, knowing where he's from, knowing that he has all the power, proceeds to take off his outer coat, wrap a towel around his waist, pour some water into a basin, and then get on his knees in front of the disciples and wash their feet. I mean, if we hadn't heard this more than as many times as we have, our breath would be taken away. I imagine that in that room, you could have heard a pin drop, if not for the sloshing of the water and the movement of the feet. I mean, the disciples must have been silent at first. I imagine our friend Benjamin, that he stood in the background, paralyzingly still. He was not going to go and get involved in this. As he shared, he was embarrassed. He would have nothing to do with this. And I imagine that he wasn't the only one who was embarrassed. I mean, the truth is, we have no idea how demeaning it was for Jesus to do what he did. Where we might feel that it kind of elevates his status. That was not the case of those in the room. In the minds of all who watched what was happening, it only served to diminish Jesus. It only served to make him look smaller, less important, less vital. It reminds me of a moment from my own experience when we had first moved to the Republic of Ireland. And I was getting to know a guy named Eugene, and he was an estate agent in the community, and he had helped us find our home. And so we were having this relationship and getting to know each other. And he invited me to go to this community meeting. So I thought, this is great. I get to know the community a little bit. I also get to know Eugene a little bit. So we sat in this meeting, and then they're talking about how can we improve our town. And in the midst of this conversation, somebody stood up and said in rather colorful language, "We need to deal with the dog." You know, and there it was in front of everybody. And I'm just sitting there going, oh, really? And they began to tell, and other people chimed in and said, yes, we need to deal with this. And so they were saying, well, what are we going to do? We said, well, we need to put more signage up. We need to put fines. We need to make sure that there are people watching, and all of this kind of stuff. And this went on for about 10 minutes, as you might imagine, the banter and the people getting more and more agitated, more and more excited in this conversation. When the person leading the meeting said, well, what are we going to do about that's out there currently? And the room went dead. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. Nobody was going to say, well, I'll clean it up. Nobody was there. And I remember I turned to Eugene and I said, I'll do it. And he looked at me like that was the dumbest thing I had ever said in my entire life, and said, why would you want to do that? You're trying to raise your profile in this community. You're not trying to, I mean, you're a pastor. You're isn't that what you call yourself? You're a priest, a father or whatever. Why would you want to do that? And it reminds me of this moment, because my guess is they're thinking the same thing. Jesus, why in the world would you want to do this? Why would you want to do this? Jesus is doing something that is considered more than highly irregular. It is considered shameful. It is considered humiliating. We like to think of it as an act of humility, but in the eyes of everyone around that table, it was humiliating, embarrassing. So shameful was it that Peter, like my friend Eugene, sought to stop Jesus doing what he was doing. Just listen.
He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he said that not everyone was clean.
When that other disciple, that one named Peter, when he got up and said to Jesus, stop, I was so relieved. I mean, it was so embarrassing to see what was taking place, that the guy at the head of the table was doing something that not even I would do. I mean, the truth is, there would be no way that I would do what he was doing. I would never live it down. I'd be an embarrassment to my family. I would bring shame to them. Now, I think some of you think that I'm exaggerating it, but it's the truth. This was beneath me. And there he was, this founder of the feast, this one who was the honored one. He was the one who was washing their feet. He was the teacher, the master, their Lord. It didn't make any sense. In some ways, it seemed like he was just coming down to their level. He wasn't lifting them to theirs. I mean, think about that. For Benjamin, it was clear, wasn't it, that the actions of Jesus were demeaning. That instead of elevating him, they did the opposite. You might say, in some respects, that what Jesus did in washing the disciples' feet emptied him of his authority, his position, his power. It reminds me of those wonderful words from Philippians 2, where Paul said, who being in very nature God, talking about Jesus, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human being. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. I've been thinking about this, how Jesus embraces the towel, much as he will later embrace the cross. He lays aside his power, his privilege, his position, all for love of you and me. You see, I think there's something we need to understand, that Peter didn't realize that love bends down, that redeeming love bends lower. This love of God meets us not in our honor, but in our shame. This love meets us not at our best, but in our worst moments. And Peter at first wants nothing of this. But the truth is, he needed this redemptive act, didn't he? More than he might appreciate at that moment. And the truth is, so do we. Jesus said, you do not realize what I am doing, but later you will understand. And I'm sure later that evening, and even later as the Holy Spirit opened their eyes to understand what Jesus had said, they understood these actions in light of the cross. Because in these actions, we discover that our Lord embraces the shame and the humiliation because of his love for you and for me. I go back to verse 1. Remember those words? He loved them to the end. He loved them. He loves us, you and me, completely, utterly, all the way. Love is the motivation. Love is the message. Love is the meaning. You might have thought that it was the end of it, but in truth, it was just the beginning. Listen.
When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place.
I was so glad when Jesus set the basin down and things went back to normal, if you get my drift, when it was over. I was so glad when the disciples were once again beginning to eat and I could go back to my job. But I have to admit, I was kind of curious as to what would happen. Because as they sat there, Jesus asked them a question. He asked them if they understood what he'd done. I remember thinking, nobody knows. I mean, it was ludicrous. What you did makes no sense. I was just glad it was over. But instead of letting it go, Jesus brought it up again. I mean, instead of it letting fade into this mistake that had been made and we'll just kind of go on, you know what I mean? He just brings it up again. And he said something that was even more awful than the act. He said that they. But truth is, I knew he was talking to me as well. That we should do as he had done. I mean, he was actually calling us to lower ourselves, to serve, he was calling us to be servants. I kind of thought about that, that's what I am. So maybe it kind of elevates my position a little bit. Maybe it's not that bad after all. Well, listen.
For you, he asked them, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them.
Like I said, we've heard these words so many times that it's easy to miss the message. Unlike our new friend, we recognize the call of humility, something that it almost seems like our friend doesn't really get. But before we're too hard on Benjamin, consider this. He understood better than you and I do the shame that Jesus willingly embraced. You might say in some respects that what we have done in the church, in our world, is we have domesticated humility. We've made it something that we can be proud of, you know. I'm so humble. We joke. In that culture, the demarcation of roles was clear. Masters didn't wash feet. Masters didn't serve. They were served. And truth is, in most Jewish homes of that day, it would have been a foreign slave who would have been tasked with the washing of feet. It was that shameful. And yet in Jesus embracing this, again, he shows that there is nowhere, and I want you to hear this, in Jesus embracing what he did, he shows us that there is nowhere that he will not go. And there is nothing that he will not do. That he will go to the end to show us his love. But as we've just heard, this wonderful news, this gospel truth, is not simply something that we receive. Jesus is calling us to join him in embracing the towel, in serving. Now, there are those who make this into a sacrament. And while I can understand that, the reality is I don't think Jesus is calling us to just wash dirty feet. Jesus said to his disciples, this is, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Notice he didn't say, I've set you an example so you do what I have done for you. You see, he's calling us, in a sense, to do something that's a little even more difficult than washing feet. He's calling us to do something that may be even more humiliating to us. He's calling us to serve. He's calling us to step down off our perches and enter the fray. He's calling us to go where no one else will go, to declare his love. He's calling us to go to the end. He's calling us to embrace the towel, and I would say the cross as well. In our Monday Bible study, we were talking about one of my favorite verses in 1 John. It's 1 John 3:16, which I think is apropos, you know, John 3:16 and 1 John 3:16. And there it reads this. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. I shared how one of my mentors, Reuben Welsh, in his book, We Really Do Need Each Other, speaks about how easy it is to read a verse like this until you realize that the call to lay down our lives is not a one-off. It's a daily exercise, much like washing your feet. Laying down your life is not something you may have to do once, but something you must do daily. As those disciples sat in the upper room, having had their feet washed by their master, he calls them to do the same. In fact, the scripture reads, as you've heard Rachel and Josue and Rose read it, and Rachel read it. We hear Jesus say, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now, my guess is that very few of us will be called to ever make the ultimate sacrifice. But I'm sure of this: all of us will be called to serve. All of us are called to serve, to wash the feet of another, to embrace a life of servanthood, to come down. And I wonder, will we? When no one else is willing to get their hands dirty, will we get ours dirty? When no one else is willing to step down into the mess, will we step down into the mess? Lauren's going to lead us in a simple song. In many ways, it's a prayer. A prayer to be like Jesus. And I wonder if we might do more than just sing these words. I wonder if we might make them our prayer this morning.